I did not move to Sacramento for the weather, though the hot summers and cool river evenings made the first months bearable. I came because contracts were plentiful and quiet living was cheaper than the Bay. The townhome off Blue Ravine Rd in Folsom was not impressive, but it was ours in a way that mattered. 2 bedrooms stacked over a narrow garage like a shoebox, a stoop large enough for a bike, and 2 pairs of small sneakers, and a thin wall through which I could hear the neighbor coughing at midnight. I arranged my desk between a temperamental ficus and the window that looked out on a strip of grass and a line of mail boxes. The kids turned the shared room into a museum of pencil drawings and acrylic splatter, and I taught them how to wash brushes properly because dried paint ruins more futures than bad teachers. My wife, Emma, called the townhome cozy, and when she was in the mood she called it hopeful. She was an ICU nurse at UC Davis Medical Center, a title she wore with a mixture of pride and exhaustion that I admired and feared. I was a contractor who wrote clean code, commented obsessively, and revised pull requests like I was polishing a stone for a grave. If I describe Emma as charismatic and volatile, it risks sounding like blame where I mean to present contours. She could light a room with a remark about a cat she saw in the parking lot. She could also pare me down with a single look and force me to apologize for wearing that look in the first place. We had 2 children, Amelia at 9 and Marco at 6. Everything I did outside the laptop, fan, and the Sprint burn-down chart was for them. I scheduled my hours around school pickups, did grocery runs at odd times to avoid crowds, and learned to braid hair badly while a skillet hissed behind me. On weekends, we took the kids to Lake Natoma, where the water shifted from slate to copper with the sun, and the trail under the oaks delivered the illusion of escape. The kids skimmed stones near the bridge, and I timed their throws like the software timers that govern my days. When I looked at Emma then, with her scrubs tied around her waist and her hair braided off her neck, I believed the word family could function like a spell against entropy. I am by nature conflict avoidant. This is not a fashionable confession. People like to say boundaries as if that becomes a talisman you hang from the rearview mirror. For me, peace was not a practice but a habit of mind. It began when I immigrated, and silence became my passport in rooms where jokes arrive faster than comprehension. It continued in marriage as a kind of trade. I presented a smooth surface and hoped the world would reflect itself back without shattering. When Emma flared, I smoothed. When money felt tight, I optimized. I measured, forecasted, squeezed coupons, taught myself how to repair a leaky faucet from a message board because calling a plumber felt like an admission. This is the part that makes people nod and say dependable, and it is also the part that makes a mouth go dry when someone you love decides to test the hinges of your life. I wish the story were a single blow, a decisive break that could be circled on a calendar. It arrived instead like a series of small dents on a rental car, annoying and easy to ignore until the day you return the keys and realize the sum. It started with Henry in a way I did not recognize as a beginning. Henry drove rideshare in the afternoons and worked as a part-time mechanic in an independent shop off Sunrise Boulevard. The shop sat behind a chain-link fence, and the asphalt was always wet for no reason. I met him when I booked a ride to pick up Marco from an after-school program that ended abruptly for a staff meeting. He arrived in a sedan that smelled like citrus cleaner and gasoline, and he recognized me later in the week, waving while I pumped gas near Greenback Lane. It felt like a small-town rhythm within a sprawl that never admits it has edges. Emma met him when she began picking up extra shifts, the ones that run through the night and fillet a person's circadian rhythm. He drove her to the hospital, picked her up when she finished, and sometimes carried grocery bags up our stairs when she said her back was a rubber band stretched to breaking. He became Uncle Henry, the generous driver who replaced a wiper blade without charging for it and found the right brake pads on sale. I tell myself I rationalized the red flags because they did not wave. They sidled. They fluttered like something friendly. Emma's overtime pay did not appear in the account with the predictability I expected. She explained that the shift differentials and bonuses come later in lumps. My budgeting app, which I set up as if it were a perimeter fence, kept showing holes that I patched with temporary transfers from an emergency fund I maintained with the piety of someone who knows everything can change in a single phone call. When I asked Emma about a charge here and there, she rolled her eyes and said it was coffee for the unit or food for the night when the cafeterias sit dark like bad teeth. I found myself nodding because the story was believable, and because disbelieving would have required power I did not feel I had. What I did not understand then was how secrecy can wear ordinary clothes. It does not always show up as a password-protected folder. Sometimes it enters the house as a favor from a man who knows how to replace a serpentine belt. The day of the check engine light did not begin as a crisis. It was a Saturday in late spring, the kind that tricks you into wearing shorts and then punishes you when the wind picks up. The kids had a birthday party for a classmate in a suburban development where the cul-de-sacs are named for trees they replaced. Balloons were tied to posts in sequence like a low-budget constellation. On the way there, the engine light blinked on. The car did not lurch or complain, but the icon glowed like a warning in a language I almost knew. We dropped the kids at the party. Emma said Henry could look at it quickly at the shop off Sunrise, that he had the scanner and it would cost nothing, that he would be grateful for the company because Saturdays without the usual crew were slow. I agreed because gratitude felt like an economy I still believed ran on goodwill. We drove to the shop, and the place looked as it always did, tools like animals sleeping in their metal cases, posters for oil brands with smiling men who never needed to wash their hands. Henry plugged in a scanner, frowned, and then asked if he could take it around the block. He was matter-of-fact and confident in a way that made me step back. I had mounted a dashcam when we first bought the car after a near miss on Sunrise. It was set to record in loops, saving clips when the G-sensor detected movement or when you pressed the button. I had an engineer's faith in small devices that capture truth without opinion. I forgot about the camera when Henry took the car. Later that night, after the balloons were deflated and the frosting had been scraped from plates, I uploaded the memory card because I am the sort of person who uploads memory cards. I meant only to confirm the route and what the error code had been. The clip that surfaced was not what I expected. The car was parked at the edge of a lot, not far from the shop's bay door, angled toward a wall, so the only view was windshield, hood, and the reflection of sky. The audio was a bed of engine idle and a low hum from the road. There was a thump as someone climbed back in, and another as the passenger door opened. The movements were not dramatic, but they were intimate in the way of choreography rehearsed enough to appear accidental. There were no words. There were the sounds of breathing that belonged to two people I loved or needed. One of them was my wife. The clip ended when the car jolted into drive. When I looked at the timestamp, it overlapped the time I was helping Marco untangle a strip of ribbon from a fence while Amelia tried to rescue a piece of cake from the grass. I stared at the progress bar for a long time. I told myself I was misreading what my body already understood. Blame shadows, not people. Tell yourself the lens sees gestures as something else, that a reach across the console could be innocent if a seatbelt snags. The improbable becomes plausible if you repeat it enough times while a washing machine thumps down the hall. I did not confront Emma that night. I did not confront Henry. I did what I always do when something breaks inside a code base. I opened a new window and took notes. In the days that followed, repayment notices began to arrive addressed to Emma and her mother. I assumed at first they were another hospital bill from a previous emergency room visit for Amelia's fractured wrist. The envelope said personal and urgent, and the letters were from a lending company whose ads I had seen pop up when searching for lawn mowers. I had never seen their logo associated with us. The language inside was not threatening, but it was insistent. The phrases I remember were delinquent and co-signed. Emma's mother has a soft voice and a way of looking over your shoulder as if a better answer is hung behind you. I wondered if they had funded a surprise trip or paid off a credit card. When I asked Emma about the letters, she frowned and said something about a clerical error, that the hospital sometimes misroutes, that it would be handled. I noticed my own reaction, which was to apologize for alarming her with a question. The following week, during a school pickup from Folsom Hills, Amelia mentioned something in the back seat while inspecting the scraped knee of her little brother. She said that Uncle Henry sometimes slept over when I was away late. She said this with the matter-of-fact tone children use when reporting a fire alarm drill. She did not imply wrongdoing. She described a fact, an arrangement she had observed, and she added a detail about scrambled eggs that surprised me not because of what it suggested, but because Emma hates eggs. I felt the steering wheel like a cold bar in my hands. I mumbled thanks without words and asked about homework in a way that betrayed nothing. Later, after I tucked them in and double-checked the school forms with the new week's schedule, I sat in the living room, surrounded by the carefully labeled baskets that were supposed to keep us organized, and I stared at the blank TV screen as if it might display a solvable problem. I confronted Emma by not confronting her. I asked hopeful questions that offered easy exits. I told myself I was protecting the children from the performance of conflict. She cried in a way that struck me as too practiced or perhaps simply honed by a job where tears arrive with the paperwork. She said I was suspicious because I did not understand ICU life. She said I was isolating her, that a marriage requires latitude, that Henry was a friend who stepped in when I was consumed by sprint deadlines. I heard the vocabulary of gaslighting extend itself around me like thick ivy, controlling, paranoid, ungrateful. She complained of chest tightness after that conversation and said she feared a panic attack. I felt the familiar reflex to rescue. She lay on the couch with a hand over her eyes and said she could not breathe. I asked whether to call someone, and she said she did not want to go but feared she would die. I drove her to the emergency department where she worked, and she kept her face averted from the triage nurse as if the shame were heavier than the fear. She was admitted for observation. I went home to the kids and a neat instruction list on a whiteboard, as if I were a stand-in in a play where the lead had stepped out without explanation. The hospital stay became a magnet for narrative, pulling in commentary from her colleagues and friends and mother. The message was that stress kills and that my worry had worsened it, that my impulse to protect was in fact an impulse to control. I recognized in these accusations a familiarity I could not disprove without becoming the thing I was accused of. I have never been good at theatrical interventions. I bought groceries, folded laundry, and waited for calls from the unit that said she would stay another night for tests. The kids asked questions I triaged with paternal language about grown-up bodies and the gusts of health. I thought about the dashcam footage as a fact without weight next to the weight of a hospital bracelet. I told myself a new story, that the intimacy was an aberration produced by fatigue, not a pattern. I wanted this to be true more than I wanted oxygen. When she came home, she was affectionate in a way that felt both familiar and foreign, like a song I recognized translated into another language. She touched my shoulder when she passed and asked about my contract with a degree of interest that made me nervous. She suggested we rebuild, a word that implied the past was a storm rather than a demolition. She asked practical questions about our budget, the way emergency funds work, and how fast money moves when moved. She said she had realized life is fragile and that we should not be so rigid about numbers. She said, in gentle terms, that she wanted access to the emergency account because if something happened to me she would be stranded in a maze of my making. She used the phrase trust and family more than once. I believed strongly in redundancy, in shared logins preserved in a printed envelope sealed and taped to the inside of a closet. She pressed for something beyond redundancy. She wanted the transfer right now for some needs I could not see. I hedged. I gave her view only access and created a smaller buffer in checking to avoid a fight. She smiled and told me I was learning to loosen. That night she hugged the children with theatrical care and promised a family day at Lake Natoma when her shifts eased again. I discovered the manipulated budgeting apps by accident. I use them the way other people use journals. I categorized, color-coded, linked accounts, and documented. I tracked cash envelopes with the precision of a baseball statistician. When a couple of categories showed underspending that did not match the evaporated checking balance, I searched for duplicates. I found a ghost account, a separate debit card that did not show in the main interface, but did appear in the backend list of connected institutions. It had the same home address as ours, but a different email suffix I had never seen. The charges were not extravagant. They were forgettable in an almost deliberate way: gas stations on the far side of town, an ATM in a strip mall behind Sunrise, and a series of motel payments under innocuous names no one notices because no one wants to say them out loud. The dates danced around her night shifts and the hours she had been kept at the hospital for tests. I felt the old instinct to rationalize flood me again and then recede, leaving a shape behind. I followed the charges to their time stamps, and the shape hardened into a pattern that could not be dismantled with hope. I scheduled a consultation with a lawyer and then postponed. The first time I told myself it was because the kids had a school project that required poster board and glue sticks and attention. The second time I told myself my contract needed renewal and I could not afford to present as distracted to a client who valued presence over brilliance. I had the number saved in my phone under a name that would not attract curiosity: tax prep. In truth, I hesitated because calling a lawyer felt like stepping into a new country without a visa, and because part of me wanted to be wrong so badly I would sabotage my own chance to be right. While I delayed, a process server handed me papers in the parking lot of the grocery store on Bidwell next to the cart return. The envelope felt heavier than it should. Emma had filed first. The petition painted me as controlling, emotionally distant, and obsessed with money in a way that stifled family life. It described a man who tracked receipts like he was tracking a suspect and created a home atmosphere of surveillance. It presented her overtime as a humanitarian impulse punished by my jealousy. It read like a story in which the villain reads bedtime stories and blares at a tablet when a kid asks for a second glass of water. My first instinct was to swallow. My second was to prove. I pulled up the Dashcam clips and froze frames on the timestamps like exhibits in a museum of denial. I printed the bank statements for the ghost debit card and highlighted the charges that lined up like a zipper with the nights she claimed to be working or sleeping off work. I printed the loan letters addressed to her and her mother and circled the phrases that pointed to a life I had not been invited to live. I gathered the cafeteria receipts for the nights I visited the hospital with soup in a thermos and flowers wrapped in paper because vases at the hospital are a hazard. I arranged these papers in a binder with tabs. I wrote a cover page in my careful hand. My lawyer, when I finally went, paged through them impressed and a little amused. He reminded me evidence is not a monologue. He reminded me that family court is not a seminar on logic and that people often prefer stories to spreadsheets. He did not say good luck. He said prepare to be called names. The custody scare arrived like a wave that breaks while you are still wading out. Emma requested temporary orders that limited my time with the children, arguing that I was emotionally unstable, that my fixation on finances made me unpredictable, that my immigrant dislocation had hardened into erratic control. She attached a letter from her mother describing my quiet as intimidation. She included a text exchange in which I asked about cash advances in a tone she described as threatening. I felt sick reading these arrangements of words about myself. I imagined Amelia reading them at 14 on a borrowed laptop and forming a new mythology in which I was the villain with the spreadsheets. My lawyer insisted we respond with facts and not with character defenses. I filed a declaration that attached the Dashcam timestamps and explained their context without adjectives. I filed bank statements and highlighted the motel charges clustered within hours of alleged night shifts. I included a calendar mapping school pickups that made nonsense of her story. I did this not because I wanted to destroy her, but because I wanted to keep the children from being enlisted in a performance. The hearing itself was a blur of fluorescent lights, white noise from an air system that seemed older than the building, and the subtle performance of strangers deciding how our family would be carved and measured. The judge examined us with the practiced neutrality of someone who has seen worse and better. Emma looked smaller than she does when she jokes at a dinner table. She presented her devotion to the ICU and the way my suspicion eroded her stability. I presented the paper bundle of my life like a farmer laying out seeds. When the judge asked a question about the Dashcam clip's timing, I focused on the numbers and described the child's birthday party like a station on a train line. I kept my voice level, and I tried not to imagine the clip playing on a screen where strangers would watch the outline of a life I had believed in. The judge did not ask for the video. The judge read the timestamps and bank statements and said a temporary order would preserve the children's routines. The split was not what Emma had requested. It was not what I would have chosen in a world where betrayal fell out of fashion. It allowed me to keep the school pickups, the Wednesday homework ritual with glue sticks and grumpy sighs, the weekend morning walk around Lake Natoma, where Marco tries to skip a larger stone each time as if distance is a promise. After the hearing, I did not feel triumphant. I felt like someone who had carried a heavy box across a room and set it down without dropping it, only to notice that the room had shifted shape while I focused on the load. The townhome remained too small for the storm it had contained. I moved my desk to the corner of the living room to make the kids' room feel less like a storage unit. I installed a deadbolt not because I feared intrusion, but because I wanted a ritual that signaled closure at night. I replaced the budgeting app's password and created a separate account for summer camp money so that a line item would not ignite an argument. I kept the dashcam, and when someone asked why, I said it was for insurance. The truth is complicated and sometimes boring. Henry remained a presence at the periphery. I saw his car once along Sunrise, parked near the shop with the chain-link fence, the hood open like a mouth that cannot close. I did not stop. I understand now that anger can be coherent without requiring action. Someone else would have found him, confronted him in a blaze of throwaway words. I understood that a spectacle would not reverse time or give my children a better story to tell their friends. It would only rehearse a failure in public. I decided the only revenge I could stomach was to become predictable in the ways that mattered to children, or arrive on time, pack lunches with fruit cut into small moons, remember the reading log, and keep shoes by the door. When Emma asked for swaps and alternate weekends with vague explanations, I requested specifics. When she sent budget claims that did not align with our order, I asked for receipts. When she accused me of pulling strings with a spreadsheet, I did not respond to the adjective. I responded to the date. Emma's mother stopped texting advice. I suspect she realized co-signing a loan for a daughter with an ICU schedule and a taste for shadow accounts had ushered us into a maze none of us were qualified to navigate. The repayment letters stopped arriving at the mailboxes by the strip of grass. I like to think it was because Emma finally confronted the numbers and made a plan. It is also possible that the account migrated to a new address with a new story to hide behind it. I learned to accept that unknowns do not all earn illumination. Some remain unknowns forever, like whether a voice was trembling from regret or performance during the hospital stay. I thought a lot about that observation period. She slept under observation while I made observations at home. Neither were the kind of observation that changes outcomes. They were only the kind that makes a person feel like a participant while the script unspools regardless. On my better days, I take the kids to Lake Natoma and let the trail do the parenting I cannot. I watch Amelia ride ahead with a cautious boldness that reminds me of Emma when she was in love with the impossible hours of nursing. I watch Marco turn twigs into lightsabers and forget the precise angle at which my marriage veered. On my worst days, the townhome is a soundtrack of small arguments about toothpaste cats, and I fold laundry in a way that keeps my hands busy enough to silence my mind. I am learning to be two people at once, a father who explains algebraic thinking with cereal bowls and an immigrant whose accent returns when the family court's clerk calls my name. People ask if I hate Emma. The true answer would bore them, because hatred implies a concentration I cannot afford. What I feel is a steady ache for a narrative that ended in the middle and then started again under a new title. I miss the version of us that sat on a picnic blanket near Blue Ravine while fireworks from a distant event popped behind treetops like a faulty sky. I'd even miss the arguments that ended with both of us laughing at how tired we were. What I do not miss is the shapeless dread that lived in my chest when the budgeting app would not reconcile and the garage smelled like a place where someone else kept their secrets. I understand now that love can be both real and ruinous. This is not a paradox for philosophers. It is a household fact. The same affection that inspires late-night soup deliveries to a hospital also inspires a person to look away from the neon signs of deceit because the light hurts. I will not pretend I did not see. I will accept that I preferred a blurrier image until it was too late to film a clean ending. My boundary is simple, the kid's stability first. It is why I keep the evidence locked in a file instead of streaming it in a fit of righteousness. It is why I meet Henry's car on sunrise with a steady speed and eyes that do not seek recognition. It is why I grant Emma's legitimate requests and deny the slippery ones without venom. It is why I still keep an emergency fund, and why I no longer believe emergencies are only financial. When I think about the dashcam now, I do not imagine the clip. I imagine the lens. It looks forward without asking whether the truth will be flattering. It records and moves on, overwriting bad moments if you do not protect them. I protected that clip because I needed to show someone else that my reality was not an invention. I wish I could delete it for myself. I keep it anyway because parenthood requires proof in a world that prefers drama to data. The children will grow and ask questions that do not deserve to be answered with silence. When that time comes, I will describe events plainly and leave space for their love for their mother, which is not a problem to be solved, but a flame to be shielded from the worst of the wind. I end with no neat go. The townhome is still too small. The trails still smell of dust and warm water. The auto shop's fence still rattles when trucks pass. UC Davis still floods the night with its own weather. Emma is still a nurse who can steady a stranger's breathing and create storm systems at home. Henry is still a driver with a toolkit and a face I avoid. I am still a man who writes code and makes lists and chooses not to stage a public hanging in a private disaster. If there is closure, it is a practical one, lunchbox is prepped, tuition paid on time, light bulbs replaced before they flicker. If there is grace, it arrives in the small moments when Amelia laughs without looking for permission and Marco falls asleep in the car on the way back from Lake Natoma, his neck bent at an angle that would hurt me but leaves him limber. I learned too late that love does not cancel cruelty. It sometimes escorts it through the door and offers it tea. I learned on time that stability can be built from boring bricks, and that the most radical thing an immigrant father can do in Sacramento is choose the children's quiet over the satisfaction of winning a story. I will live with the rest. I will carry the binder until it is no longer needed. I will keep moving forward, even when the lens records something I wish it would miss.